The smoke had already started rising from Dale Hutchins's property next door when he crossed the fence line without being invited. "Marlene," his voice was flat, "certain, you need to get those piles burning before the first frost locks them in. You're going to have a mess come spring." Marlene Calloway didn't look up from the row of garlic she was pressing into the ground, one bulb at a time. The leaves were everywhere: maple, oak, hickory, blanketed across every bed, every path, every corner of her 7-acre farm, like a quilt pulled up to the chin of something sleeping. "I heard you, Dale. You hear me every time. Doesn't seem to change what you do." She pressed another bulb into the dark earth. "No," she said quietly, "it doesn't." He stood there a moment longer, watching the leaves settle in the wind. Then he walked back to his own land, where the flames were already eating clean through a mountain of dry oak. Nobody understood what Marlene was doing. Most figured grief had made her slow. Some thought she'd simply given up. A few were already whispering that the Calloway place would go under by June. They were wrong about all of it, but they wouldn't know that for a long time. If you've ever trusted something others couldn't see yet, this story is for you. Subscribe so you never miss one of these. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from: the US, Canada, the UK, Australia. We love knowing who's out there. And stay with us, because by the end of this, you're going to learn something about soil that will change the way you look at autumn forever. Marlene had buried her husband, Curtis, in September. He had worked that land for 31 years, first as a tenant, then as an owner, one small parcel at a time. By the time he died of a heart attack between the barn and the greenhouse, they had 7 acres, a respectable vegetable operation, a small apple orchard, and a reputation in Clover Falls, Ohio, for growing the sweetest early corn in the county. What they also had, and what nobody outside the farm fully understood, was a way of doing things that other local farmers considered peculiar. Curtis had learned it from his own grandmother, a woman who farmed deep in rural Georgia without the money for fertilizer or herbicide, and who had developed, over decades, an almost instinctive relationship with what the land asked of her. She had taught Curtis that the leaves were not waste. They were payment, from the trees to the soil, in preparation for next year. "Let them work," she used to say. "You don't pay wages twice." Curtis had told Marlene this the first autumn they farmed together. She had been skeptical then. She was not skeptical anymore. But now Curtis was gone. And Marlene, 54 years old, alone for the first time in her adult life, stood in the middle of October with 7 acres of leaves and a community that was watching to see whether she would fall apart. She had no intention of falling apart. What she was not sure about was whether she had the stamina to hold to the plan without Curtis beside her. The first person to say something publicly was Patrice Waller, who ran the Farmers' Co-op on Route 9 and who had known Marlene for years without ever quite understanding her. "Marlene, honey," Patrice rested a hand on her arm at the feed store. "Those leaves are going to mat down and suffocate everything underneath. You know that, right? You need to get them turned under or burned off." Curtis never burned them," Marlene said. Patrice blinked. "He didn't?" "No." A pause. "Well?" Patrice glanced at the other women near the counter. "Maybe you might want to ask around before you just carry on the same way. Circumstances are different now." Marlene paid for her seed garlic and left. By November, the conversation had spread. Neighbors who had been friendly since Curtis's funeral began showing up with advice that felt more like verdict. Dale Hutchins told her point blank that matted leaves would create a breeding ground for fungal disease. Ron Bassett, who farmed 60 acres just east of the county road, drove over specifically to tell her he'd lost a full strawberry bed to leaf rot back in 2009, and he'd never made the same mistake again. It came to a head one Saturday morning at Patrice's co-op. Marlene was picking up twine when Dale came in with 2 other men from the north end of the county. Someone asked how the Calloway place was looking. Dale said, "Like nobody lives there," and there was laughter. "Easy, unguarded laughter, the kind people don't bother to hide when they're sure they're right. Marlene set the twine on the counter, paid, and walked out without turning around. Even Marlene's sister, Cheryl, who lived in Columbus and knew almost nothing about farming, called on a Sunday evening. "People are talking, Marlene. They're saying the place is going to look abandoned by March. Is that what Curtis would have wanted?" Marlene sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment. "Curtis is the one who taught me," she said. "So yes, probably." She hung up. But in the quiet of the kitchen afterward, with the darkness settling heavy over the farm, she held her mug in both hands and wondered, for just a moment, whether memory was a reliable guide or only a comfortable one. What the neighbors saw was untidiness. What was actually happening beneath those leaves was invisible to the naked eye, and extraordinary. As the autumn rains came and the temperatures began to drop, the leaf layer on Marlene's fields was doing several things at once. It was holding moisture in the soil at a time when other farms were watching their topsoil crack and lift in the November wind. The leaf canopy slowed evaporation, trapping what little warmth the sun still offered during the short afternoons. Below the leaves, earthworm populations, already healthy from years of Curtis's no-burn practice, were working overtime. Earthworms thrive in the presence of decomposing organic matter. They were pulling leaf fragments downward, converting them into castings that are, gram for gram, among the most nutrient-dense materials any soil can receive. And deeper still, something slower and more significant was beginning. A network of mycorrhizal fungi, the fungal threads that connect plant roots and allow them to share water and nutrients across distances, was expanding through the insulated soil. Cold kills fungal networks in bare, unprotected ground. The leaf layer held enough warmth to keep those networks alive and growing, even as the temperature above the surface dropped toward freezing. Marlene didn't explain any of this to her neighbors. She had tried, once, early in her marriage, to explain it to Dale Hutchins. He had looked at her the way people look at someone speaking a language they have decided not to learn. She didn't try again. January came hard that year, a January nobody in Clover Falls was prepared for. 2 weeks of temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by a sudden thaw, followed by a week of freezing rain that coated everything in an inch of ice. When the ice finally cleared, and Marlene walked her fields in early February, she found something that stopped her cold. The leaves on the low end of the property, the quarter-acre that sat in the slight depression near the old drainage ditch, had compacted under the weight of the ice into a dense, airless mat. The earthworms had retreated deeper. The surface smelled faintly of anaerobic decay, the wrong kind of breakdown, the kind that produces acids instead of nutrients. She knelt and pushed her fingers through the mat. It was impenetrable in places, grey and compressed. This was what Dale had warned her about. She stood up slowly, and for the first time all season, she felt uncertain. She walked back to the house and pulled out the old binder where Curtis had kept his notes. 20 years of observations in his careful handwriting, annotated with dates and temperatures and drawings of root structures. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, reading. She did not find a solution, not directly. But she found a note from the winter of 2011, when something similar had happened. Curtis had written simply, "The mat is not the end. Break the surface. Let the worms back to the edge. The middle takes care of itself." She read it 3 times. Then she went back outside. Marlene spent 3 days in February doing something that looked, from the road, even more inexplicable than leaving the leaves alone. She was turning the compressed mat in the low corner by hand, not raking it away, not burning it, but gently breaking the surface, lifting it in sections, allowing air back in, without exposing the raw soil beneath. She worked with a broad fork and her hands, creating small channels where the leaf material could resume its work. Dale watched from his fence line one afternoon, arms crossed. "What are you doing now?" "Aerating," she said. He shook his head. "You're wasting energy on a lost cause." She didn't answer. What she had understood, reading Curtis's notes, was that the ice event had disrupted the surface, but not the deeper process. The mycorrhizal network below the frost line was still intact. The earthworms in the central and upper fields had survived. The problem was only at the surface, and it was a solvable one, if she addressed it before the late winter freeze came back. Over those 3 days, something else happened that she hadn't predicted. A colony of ground-nesting beneficial insects, native bees that had been sheltering in the protected leaf layer, became visible as she worked. She moved carefully around them, leaving their section of the mat untouched. She noted their location in her own binder. She did not know it yet, but they would matter enormously in April. March arrived the way it does in Ohio, without commitment. Some days were almost warm, most weren't. The ground thawed in the morning and refroze at night. Farmers around Clover Falls were already running tillers over bare fields, breaking up the compacted, leaf-free soil in preparation for planting. Their fields were dry, dusty even. The topsoil on Ron Bassett's upper field lifted in the March wind and drifted across the county road in a thin brown haze. Marlene's fields held their moisture like a sponge. When she finally pulled a corner of leaves back in mid-March to check beneath, she found something that made her sit down right there in the cold mud. The soil underneath was dark, deeply, richly dark, the color of good coffee, of chocolate, of something alive. The earthworm castings had created a crumbly, open texture that her fingers moved through like the soil was meeting her halfway. The smell was sweet and faintly mineral, complex. It was the smell Curtis used to describe as the farm breathing. She pressed her palm flat against it and held it there. April unfolded slowly, and then all at once. The leaves, what remained of them, which was less than half of what had fallen, the rest having already become soil, were gently raked to the edges of the beds as planting began. They would serve as side dressing through the growing season, continuing to break down and feed the beds from the margins. The garlic Marlene had pressed in October came up 3 inches taller than any garlic on the neighboring farms. The reason was simple. The insulated soil had allowed the roots to establish deeply through the winter, instead of going dormant in frozen ground. Those roots were already accessing the nutrient network that had been quietly building since November. The tomato seedlings she transplanted in early May went into soil so friable and alive that they seemed to root within days. By the end of May, they were ahead of schedule by nearly 2 weeks. But it was the low corner, the one that had iced over and frightened her in January, that told the most complete story. The ground-nesting bees that had sheltered in the leaf mat emerged in April, just as her apple orchard began to bloom. Marlene had managed that orchard, just under 2 acres of apple trees in the far corner of the property, for 12 years, and had never seen pollination this dense. Every branch was working. Every flower was attended to. Ron Bassett's orchard, east along the county road, had been burned clean and tilled flat the previous fall. The bees there were sparse. The bloom was thin. By the time June arrived, the difference in fruit set between the 2 orchards was visible from the road. Dale Hutchins drove past twice before he finally stopped and got out of his truck. He stood at Marlene's fence for a long moment, looking at the orchard, then at the tomato rows, then at the garlic, tall, dark green, beginning to curl into their signature spirals. "Marlene," he said finally. She was pulling a weed near the fence. She straightened and looked at him. He didn't apologize. That wasn't his way. But he took his hat off, which was something. "Those bees," he said, "where'd they come from?" "They were here all winter," she said, "under the leaves." He looked at the orchard again. "My bloom was thin this year." "I know," she said. A long silence. "Curtis teach you all of this?" "His grandmother taught him," Marlene said. "He taught me." Dale nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands. He was a proud man, and he was working against that pride in real time, visibly. "Would you be willing," he said finally, "to maybe talk about it? At the co-op meeting, some of the younger folks are asking questions about doing things different." Marlene looked at her orchard, at the bees moving through the white blossoms, at the soil, dark and giving and full of everything she and Curtis had chosen to protect. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing." Marlene spoke at the Clover Falls Agricultural Co-op in June. She brought soil samples in mason jars, one from her fields, one that Ron Bassett had donated from his own, out of genuine curiosity. She set them side by side on the table. The difference was visible before she said a word. Hers was dark, dense, structured, full of aggregates and pores where water and air could move freely. His was lighter, compacted, sandy at the margins. She explained, without lecturing, what had happened across that winter. How leaves, left in place, act as a slow-release feeding system for the soil food web. How earthworms, given organic matter to work with, produce castings that improve soil structure and increase nutrient availability. How the mycorrhizal fungal networks that connect plant roots require organic mulch and insulation to survive the winter, and how those networks, once lost, can take years to rebuild. How ground-nesting native bees, which represent nearly a third of all bee species in North America, require undisturbed leaf litter to complete their life cycles. How a single unburned autumn could build more soil fertility than several seasons of synthetic fertilizer. Nobody laughed. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when people are genuinely listening. A young farmer named Terence Flood, who had just taken over his father's property on the north side of the county, raised his hand. "So, the whole time, the leaves were doing the work." "They always were," Marlene said. "We just kept stopping them." Patrice Waller planted a test plot that fall, half burned, half covered. She sent Marlene a photograph the following June of what the soil looked like under each section. Marlene kept the photograph on the refrigerator. Dale Hutchins did not burn his leaves that autumn. He didn't make an announcement about it. He just didn't burn them. In the spring, when his garlic came up stronger than usual, he told Ron Bassett it was probably the variety. Ron Bassett left half his orchard floor covered. By the second year, the pollination had improved enough that he mentioned it publicly. Knowledge moves through a community the way water moves through good soil, slowly, persistently, finding its way through every available path. Marlene continued farming. She was not a hero of the story, in her own estimation. She was a woman who had listened carefully to someone she loved and had held on to what she heard, even when holding on was hard. On a quiet morning the following October, standing at the edge of the orchard as the first leaves began to fall again, she thought about Curtis's grandmother, a woman she had never met, who had figured out something important on a farm with no money and no formal training and no one to confirm what she was learning. The wisdom had traveled through one generation, then another, and had arrived here, in this Ohio orchard, in this exact morning light, because each person in the chain had chosen to carry it forward instead of letting it go. She watched a maple leaf spiral down and settle against the base of the nearest tree. She left it where it landed. Marlene knelt and pressed her palm flat against the dark earth, the way she had in March. It was still breathing. The leaves were never waste. They were the next harvest, quietly preparing itself. What looks like clutter is sometimes just patience, working ahead of where you're looking. Some of the most important things you'll ever do will be the things other people don't understand yet.